Chapter 3. Mordecai makes a stand. And all the king's servants who were at the king's gate bowed down and paid homage to Haman, for the king had so commanded concerning him. But Mordecai did not bow down or pay homage. And when Haman saw that Mordecai did not bow down or pay homage, Haman was filled with fury, but he disdained to lay hands on Mordecai alone. So, as they had made known to him the people of Mordecai, Haman sought to destroy all the Jews, the people of Mordecai, throughout the whole kingdom of Ahasuerus. Esther 3:2, 5 and 6. After these things, King Ahasuerus promoted Haman, the Agagite, the son of Hammedatha, and advanced him and set his throne above all the officials who were with him. And all the king's servants who were at the king's gate bowed down and paid homage to Haman, for the king had so commanded concerning him. But Mordecai did not bow down or pay homage. Esther 3:1 and 2. Mordecai refused to pay homage to the newly appointed vizier, Haman. Opinions may vary as to why exactly Mordecai refused to bow. The king had commanded it and everyone else was doing it, but not Mordecai. He alone was refusing to bow. Why? Some scholars have thought that Mordecai did not want to bow down before any human being, giving worship to man that is due to God alone. Yet Mordecai apparently had no qualms about bowing down before Ahasuerus, the king. In chapter 8, Esther likewise would throw herself down at the king's feet to beg for her people to be spared. It was only bowing to Haman that Mordecai found problematic. Other scholars have argued that Mordecai was being obstinately arrogant in his refusal to bow, or that he was jealous of Haman for having been promoted to the office of vizier, but there is no hint of either of those attitudes in the text. The text itself suggests the reason why Mordecai did not bow, if we look closely enough. Haman was an Agagite. He was thus a descendant of Agag the Amalekite, the ancient tribal enemy of the Jews. When Israel came out of Egypt, the Amalekites attacked them in the wilderness, for which God cursed them and condemned them to extinction. Exodus 17, 8-16. Because of that assault, God declared that there would be a lasting enmity between the two peoples, and he committed himself to blot out all the remembrance of Amalek from the face of heaven. In the time of King Saul, God sent Israel to carry out that sentence on Amalek, destroying man and beast. 1 Samuel 15. But Saul failed to carry out the terms of holy war as God had commanded him to do. Instead, he spared the best of the animals, and King Agag himself, the best of the people. Saul claimed that he had the best of motives, of course. He said that he simply wanted to offer the animals as sacrifices before the Lord, which of course left unanswered the question of what he intended to do with King Agag. A king's ransom is perhaps the most obvious goal in leaving him alive. In God's sight, however, obedience is better than sacrifice. Doing what God says is better than creatively attempting to produce our own plan to serve him. For this act of disobedience, Saul was abandoned by God and rejected. 1 Samuel 15:28. So for Mordecai, whose genealogy links him to King Saul's family, to bow to Haman, a descendant of King Agag's family, was just too much to swallow. It would have seemed to be giving in to a hated enemy whom God had cursed. Bowing to King Ahasuerus, the pagan authority set over God's people by God on account of their sin, was one thing. Bowing to Haman was another thing altogether. Further evidence for this interpretation comes in the ensuing events. Then the king's servants who were at the king's gate said to Mordecai, "Why do you transgress the king's command?" And when they spoke to him day after day, and he would not listen to them, they told Haman, in order to see whether Mordecai's words would stand, for he had told them that he was a Jew. Esther 3:3 and 4. Mordecai presumably recounted the history of his people to the other servants of the king when they challenged him over his repeated refusal to bow to Haman. This rationale explains why, when they finally reported him to Haman for his insubordination, Mordecai's Jewishness was a key element of their report. Mordecai and Daniel's friends. Not for the first time, the text of Esther invites us to compare the characters in its story with those in the book of Daniel. Earlier, we saw how Daniel and Esther were both offered the king's food, and how very different the responses were from one another. Daniel's three friends also refused to bow at the knee at the king's command, though in their case, it was not a matter of bowing to an official of the king, but to a huge golden idol, Daniel 3. In their case, obedience to God left them no choice. Whether God delivered them or not, they could not, in good conscience, bow before this idol. Daniel 3:17 and 18. The issue was black and white. They would burn before they would turn. In comparison to Daniel's grand act of defiance, Mordecai's stand, while at one level justifiable enough in its motivation, seems to latch onto a relatively secondary issue. It was an issue involving shades of gray, rather than black and white. The kind of question over which faithful believers might come to different conclusions. It is not that Mordecai was being totally unreasonable in his reluctance to bow to Haman, but we wonder whether this was the right issue for making a stand. Think of how many other compromises Mordecai has made in order to remain alive and employed in the Persian court. Indeed, Mordecai worked so hard to fit in as a good citizen of the empire, that when we hear the Jewish exiles described as those whose laws are different from those of every other people, and who do not obey the king, we feel that Mordecai, at least, was being grossly misrepresented. Esther 3:8. Even though the charge should have been true of all God's people, Mordecai was far from being an obstinate standout. He showed little enough concern over the ethical issues involved in his cousin Esther being taken into the harem of the Gentile king, with its defiling food and corrupting practices. In fact, he was the one who insisted that, far from being in the least bit different from other peoples, Esther should entirely conceal her Jewishness. He was no Shadrach, Meshach, or Abednego. He had been a good servant of the empire, quietly obeying all of the other laws of the king, committed to fitting in. Yet now bowing to Haman was a bridge too far. Here he stood, and could do no other, his conscience captive to a higher call. Is it better that he had discovered some convictions late, than never to have found any at all? Perhaps, but Mordecai's line in the sand was still drawn over what seems to have been a relatively secondary issue. Jesus complained about the Pharisees of his day, that they swallowed camels, but strained at gnats. Matthew 23:24. What a vivid picture of many of our churches. We are expert gnat strainers, sieving out with precision the wrong movies, the inappropriate clothes and hairstyles, the sinful styles of music, any minor deviances from traditional church practice, wherever and whenever we encounter them. Yet at the same time, we may easily tolerate in ourselves and those around us camel-sized sins, such as gossip about others, or pride in our own accomplishments, or prayerlessness. We won't bow the knee to Haman, come what may, but we will easily fall for many greater sins. This is not to say that we should let the gnats slide down our throats unchallenged. Jesus did not mean that we should become careless about what we watch, or about how we conduct ourselves before a watching world. Mordecai was not necessarily wrong to refuse to bow before Haman, but let's major on the majors. There were perhaps other places where Mordecai should have first started to exercise his newfound convictions. We might say to Mordecai, get a sense of priorities. Don't shoot flies with cannonballs.